Do you ever catch yourself saying, English is just crazy? Maybe your students come across a tricky word and you tell them, you just have to memorize that one, or this is the part you have to know by heart. But deep down, you know it's still confusing. Here's the truth. English isn't random. It's a wonderfully complex system, and once you understand how that system works, through sound, structure, and meaning, everything changes. That's what Sarah, Paul, and I teach inside Mastering Morphology. This isn't another curriculum. It's deep teacher knowledge inside a practical, comprehensive course that finally shows you how words really work. No more exceptions, no more gimmicks or patching holes with memorization or phonics alone. It's time to go beyond sound it out and give your students the framework they need to truly understand words. So if you're ready to stop guessing and start teaching with confidence, join us inside Mastering Morphology. Enrollment is open now, so we invite you to click the link in the show notes to get started. You're listening to episode 69 of Literacy in Color. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. If you teach kindergarteners, or if you have a kindergartner, this episode is especially for you. Today, we're diving headfirst into what traditionally have been called kindergarten reading levels. If you came up through balanced literacy or guided reading, you know these levels well. A, B, C, and D. You've probably leveled your library, leveled your kids, leveled your running records, and maybe even lost sleep over a student who just isn't moving up to the next level. Today, I want to tell you the truth, kindly but honestly, on what these levels actually mean and why they are not appropriate for beginning readers. First things first, there's a narrative floating around science of reading circles that the whole leveling system is made up. And I get where that feeling comes from. They are arbitrary. They are not based on how children actually learn to read. But it's also true that Fountas and Pinnell did have a rhyme and reason behind them. It just wasn't very scientific. So back in 1996, when they first published guided reading, they described the 10 text characteristics they used to level books A through M. They literally laid out piles of children's books, from simplest to most complex, and then identified patterns. Then in 2007, they eventually expanded it to levels A through Z. They considered things like genre, text structure, content, themes and ideas, language and literacy features, the complexity of sentences, vocabulary, how difficult the words were to read, the kind of illustration support, and then book and print features. Albeit the how difficult the words are to read criteria was based on MSV and predictable text structures, not necessarily decodability. And you may also think about a book that has a very low readability level, but then has more serious themes or ideas inside. So that book may be considered a higher reading level because the topics inside may not be as appropriate for younger learners. If you recall the anecdote from Sold a Story, that podcast episode where assessing reading levels was attributed to being as reliable as a coin flip, Matt Burns shared that, sure, He could spend money on this leveled reading assessment. He could train every teacher to administer it, and of course have them take half an hour with every child. But at the end of the day, a teacher could just flip a coin and get results that were just about as accurate. He went on to share that when it came to using running records as some kind of screening data to spot the students who were truly struggling, those types of assessments did an even poorer job at catching the students who needed the most urgent support. So it wasn't even as reliable as a 50-50 coin flip. It correctly identified only about a third of those students. So it's no doubt that this concept of reading levels are misaligned with the reading brain. But what do they measure? What was the purpose of some of these levels? I want to preface all of this by saying I am not in any way teaching you to do these things. So for the record, let it be known, Michelle Sullivan is anti-predictable pattern books for beginning readers. But as with anything in life, I think we're smarter when we know the opposition. It makes you more intelligent to share why they aren't effective rather than just saying they're quote unquote bad. So let's start with level A. This is what I like to call the illusion of reading. Balanced literacy itself acknowledged that children do not need letter sound knowledge to read a level A text. That should stop us in our tracks already. Why? Because the system wasn't designed to require decoding. It was designed to require memorization and picture cueing. The whole purpose of a level A book was to practice concepts about print and this notion of one-to-one match. Can they point to a word and say a word at the same time? And I swear to you, I learned this in a training, that if they pointed and said, I like cheese, when the words actually said, see the pizza, that was 100% okay. Again, the purpose was one-to-one match. Do they know that a word is a word and it's an utterance of language? And just an aside though, why not just practice one-to-one match inside connected text when students learn some letters and relationships? Inside a level A book, you'd find these types of characteristics. One line of print, a simple repetitive pattern such as I like blank, one changing word per picture, and then pictures that make the missing word completely obvious. So essentially there would be a picture of bananas and you can say, I like bananas. And the teacher is trained to introduce the pattern before the child reads. Once that pattern is introduced, the reading sounds fluent, but it's truly pattern memorization, picture dependency, and guessing, hence the illusion of reading. It's not decoding, it does not promote orthographic mapping, and it does not build the alphabetic principle. I also remember sitting in a training once when the facilitator taught a strategy called mass shared reading for level A and B books. The idea was in a shared setting or one-on-one, you can read the book 3 to 4 times in a row with a child until they memorized it. And that was the entire goal, memorization. And then one of the most eye-opening moments for me came when I was working with a dual language kindergarten classroom using leveled readers. The book was entitled Me gusta la fruta. I like the fruit. It was a level A text, and these were English-speaking students learning to read in Spanish. And at first it felt simple enough. Fruta and fruit are cognates, easy win. And students quickly picked up the pattern, me gusta la, me gusta el, and they were feeling confident and successful. Good. And then we turned the page. Suddenly, the repeating pattern ended with the word zanahorias, carrots. Now, these native English-speaking 5-year-olds absolutely knew what carrots were. But zanahorias, a 5-syllable Spanish word introduced in a level A book for children who were literally just beginning to learn the language, they had no idea what that word was. And the only way to read it was to look at me like a deer in headlights. And that moment really crystallized things for me on how leveled texts aren't actually built around supporting decoding or language acquisition, really. They're built around pattern memorization, even when the vocabulary itself is wildly inappropriate. It also reinforced something foundational, the importance of language. If students don't have the vocabulary or background knowledge, these level texts become completely inaccessible because the entire system depends on kids showing what they see in the picture. If they don't know the word, the picture can't rescue them. So what about level B? We're singing the same song over here, but moving on to a second verse. Essentially, it holds the exact same idea as level A. Students are practicing one-to-one match without the need to decode, but now instead of one line of print, there are 2 lines of text. So the concept about print reading behavior that we're looking for here is if they can return sweep their finger to the next line. It still has predictable patterns. It still requires picture-driven guessing, but the picture also may be a little less obvious. So for example, in a level A book, the carrots might be the only thing on the page. In a level B book, the carrots might be in a bowl on the table. And still, no phonics is required. In fact, balanced literacy trainers have even said a child should not be able to pick up a level A or B book out of a level A or B book bin and be able to read it independently without having been introduced the pattern yet. It would be impossible. They need that initial pattern in order to be successful. And I think essentially that tells us everything we need to know. If a child can't read the book without it being pre-taught the words to memorize, the book is not aligned with early reading development. Level C is interesting because on paper, this is where decoding is supposed to start. But even here, these levels were often split into transitional Cs and solid Cs. So a transitional C with the naked eye looks easier than a level B book because we're going back to one line of print per page. It may still have a predictable pattern, but students are ready to use the first letter sound and their knowledge of high-frequency words to try to lift some words off the page. It may be stacked more heavily with some decodable words, but that isn't necessarily always the case. Again, MSV is still the mode for decoding here. And then for a solid C, it may have 2 lines of print and the pattern goes away. However, students are still expected to use that MSV, but maybe they're using the first and last letter to decode. And perhaps when there is a CVC word, they're trying to break that into onset and rhyme. The system still pushes guessing from context, checking the first letter or maybe the last letter, and using pictures to confirm the meaning. This is the classic MSV cueing system, which decades of cognitive science tells us is not how skilled readers read. Skilled readers need phonemic awareness, grapheme phoneme correspondences, eventually orthographic mapping, and essentially when they're tapping into meaning, it's a thinking process, not a decoding strategy. MSV encourages the exact opposite. And finally, let's briefly tackle that level D text. This is where a kindergartner under a balanced literacy framework is typically required to end the year. Essentially, we see more words, more print, but still no systematic scope and sequence. Level D text may have more lines of print, perhaps 2 to 6 lines per page. There may even be some dialogue amongst the characters or a range of punctuation. We'll see more high-frequency words in action, as well as some inflectional endings like suffix S or ing. I remember learning that by level D, students also should have memorized at least 25 high-frequency words. The problem is that while some words can technically be decoded inside a level D book, the array of phonics skills in one text is all over the map. Sure, you may spy a CVC word or 2, But you'll also find an array of silent E words, words with vowel teams, R-controlled vowels. It isn't systematic. So essentially, they're being asked to solve words and texts that are not aligned to any phonics scope and sequence. So even if kids appear to be reading a level D text, they might not be able to read a CVC word in isolation. And it's largely because guided reading success is not decoding success. It's success of whose brain has more memorization power. And guess what? You're leaving a lot of kids behind with that kind of model. Another issue I want to bring up with these kindergarten levels, and this is something I was explicitly taught by big names in the balanced literacy world, is this whole notion of finger pointing. At levels A and B, finger pointing is strongly encouraged because we're supposed to be looking for one-to-one match. But by level C, we start to wean the finger away. And at level D, finger pointing is supposed to be completely dropped. At that point, students are expected to track print with their eyes only. I remember hearing this and thinking, is this real life? As a fully literate adult, I still finger point when I hit a big, tricky word that isn't orthographically mapped for me yet. And finger pointing isn't a developmental flaw. It's a perfectly normal support for coordinating attention, tracking print, and problem solving. The idea that 5-year-olds should abandon it by a certain reading level, while simultaneously being handed unpredictable texts full of words they can't decode, is just wild to me. So what's the big problem with kindergarten guided reading levels? I want to be clear that this is not me being some kind of science of reading meanie picking on balanced literacy camps, but with a sense of urgency, abort, abort, abort. The big issue is that these levels measure how well a child can compensate for the fact that they cannot yet decode. These levels promote memorizing patterns, using picture cues, guessing based on meaning or syntax, checking the first letter, and thinking, does this make sense? Instead of, does this match the sounds? All of this is what the MSV cueing system teaches, and MSV has been repeatedly shown to be unsupported by reading science. Kindergarteners should not be spending time memorizing pattern texts. They need to be building that reading brain, that solid foundation. That means we're bringing in phonemic awareness, systematic explicit phonics instruction. Concepts about print can be addressed through actual decoding when they're ready for that work. We're using decodable text aligned with a phonics scope and sequence. Time spent on handwriting to support the reading brain because proper letter formation also builds letter knowledge. And then opportunities to practice decoding real words, not just guessing them. And guess what? We can still build language with rich read-alouds. We know that decodable texts connect directly to the phonics skills they've learned. They reduce cognitive load, they support orthographic mapping, and they give children early success that is real and not performative. This is what prepares students to become fluent readers, not pattern guessers. And for anyone who argues that leveled texts promote the joy of reading, while decodables somehow rob kids of that joy, I just want to pause and ask, what kind of joy are we talking about exactly? Is it truly more joyful for a kid to rotely read, I like the carrots, I like the bananas, I like the apples, page after predictable page, than reading Pat and Sam sat at the mat where every single word is one they could actually decode and own? There's no glitz or magic in those pattern level A and B books. They're not rich stories. They're often not humorous. And they're often not even interesting. They're repetitive sentence frames designed to be guessed and not read. The real joy, the joy that lights up a child's face, comes from the moment when they realize, oh my gosh, I read that. My brain just read a word. That's the spark. That's the magic. That's the kind of joy that builds readers. If your school still hasn't made shifts from balanced literacy to structured literacy, or you have teachers holding on to their leveled text for dear life, kindergarten is a great place to start the change. Instead of focusing on levels, focus on matching students' reading materials to what they're actually learning in phonics instruction, so that students can actually practice decoding words rather than being externally assigned an arbitrary reading letter level. If we truly want to give kindergartners the gift of reading, we need to shift from teaching kids to read predictable books to teaching kids to read the actual code of our language. Predictable pattern books don't build readers. The alphabetic principle does. Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.